Hi everyone, my name is Kory Floyd and I'm a professor of communication at the University of Arizona. I've spent a good portion of my career studying how people come together and make emotional connections, how they create intimacy and express affection in their close relationships. And of course, a very important aspect of creating connection is what we do when we don't feel like we have enough connection. And that's the condition that we call loneliness. I've been asked to respond to some questions that you've provided about the experience of loneliness, and particularly about how to manage loneliness during the holiday season, which can be a very difficult time if you don't feel particularly close to your family, if you're not around close friends that you can spend the holidays with, or especially if you're grieving the loss of a loved one who's not with you that holiday for the first time. So let me delve right into the questions that you've given me, and I'm going to offer my best answers. Some of these are based on experience, some of these are based on actual research. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to address every question in its entirety, but I'm hoping I can give you at least some tips and strategies that you can use and put into place in your own life to feel a little less lonely this holiday season. So the first question that I've been sent is, how does one learn to live with loneliness? How can we develop happiness and contentment despite being lonely? And I think that's such a great question to start with. I think one thing that's important to remember is that loneliness isn't necessarily abnormal. All of us feel lonely from time to time. It's when loneliness becomes chronic, and especially when it becomes intense, that it begins to really cause us problems. And if you find yourself in a situation like that, I think there's a few different things that can help. One of them is to become aware, pay attention to your trigger times. That is, the times or situations in which you feel the most lonely. For some people, that's in the evening when they get home from work and they're not around coworkers and friends any longer. For some people, it's the weekend for the same reason, that the connections that they have during the week aren't there anymore. It could be the holidays, of course. But pay attention to the times when you feel the most lonely, because doing that will help you make a plan. You can say to yourself, if I know that I'm likely to feel lonely this weekend, or I'm likely to feel lonely this evening, that allows you to plan ahead and create some activities, create some space. It could be something that you do outdoors. It could be going to a movie. It could even be connecting with people online in social chats and things like that. If the time that you're going to feel lonely is known to you, then you can be proactive about those times, and that will allow you to enjoy the times when you're not feeling particularly lonely a little bit more. In line with that, I think it's important to remember that you don't necessarily need other people to be able to do something rewarding. We often think, well, I would go out to dinner, I would go to a play, I would go hiking if I had somebody to share those activities with. And I think if we can reframe our thinking a little bit and recognize that you can be your own best company, you can find those things valuable and meaningful even if you're not sharing them with somebody else, then it gives you the freedom to go to a movie on your own, or to plan a vacation on your own and get value in that without framing it as something that is lacking because you're there by yourself. I think a third piece of advice, and this is going to be important throughout my message today, is just to be kind to yourself. So many of us are trained and we practice being kind to others and thinking about the needs of others in our families, in our close relationships, for instance. And all of that is good, but it can make us forget that it's important to self-care, to think about being compassionate toward ourselves, and that if we are feeling bad, if we're feeling lonely, that's okay. We're allowed to feel that way. And we can take time and we can make effort that's directed inward at doing something that's better for ourselves. thinking about times when we have felt very supported by other people, or giving ourselves a gift, or reaching out to somebody who's important in our own lives and expressing our love and affection for them. All of these can be ways to care for ourselves in those times when we feel particularly cut off from other people. So that's important to keep in mind throughout everything that we're going to talk about today. The second question that I've gotten is more specific to the holidays, and it comes from somebody who says, I do a lot of the things that research suggests. I volunteer, I have people over to create new memories, I go out, but the holidays in particular feel especially lonely. I feel a special void during that time, and why doesn't staying busy fill that void? And that's a really good question, in that we often think if I can just keep myself busy, then I won't feel lonely. And that's sort of a half-truth. It's valuable to be involved in activities, but sometimes busyness on its own can really be nothing more than just a distraction from us. And there's value in distraction, certainly. But I think it's important when we think about the things that we want to do with our time, to choose things that we're going to find meaning in, that we're going to find value in. So don't go to a movie or to a play or go hiking just for something to fill the time, but do those things because you can look for value in them. You can find meaning in those activities, in engaging in them and reflecting on them, in thinking about what they mean for you. And that's true during the holidays and really during any time that we feel a sense of social connection. For the holidays, though, in particular, I think it's really useful to be proactive in finding people to spend time with. And it doesn't have to be family. It doesn't have to be co-workers. It can be your neighbors. It can be a close friend. It can maybe just be one person that you want to reconnect with. And when we feel lonely, some of us feel a real hesitation to reach out to other people in our lives and say, hey, what are you doing for Thanksgiving? What are you doing for New Year's Eve? Because that feels like we're inviting ourselves into their plans. And some of us are very hesitant about that, fishing for an invitation to join people. And that's because loneliness can really make us believe that other people don't want us around, that they don't value our company. Or that they don't value us as much as we value them. And it's important to recognize that that's a distortion, that's distorted thinking. That's loneliness making you feel less valuable to other people. And so an important first step is recognizing that tendency and remembering that just because I'm telling myself that when I feel lonely doesn't necessarily mean it's true. If you value your friends, if you value your neighbors enough to ask them about their holiday plans, tell yourself, remind yourself that they value you every bit as much, that they value your company as much as you would value theirs. So be bold, be proactive. And again, it doesn't have to be a large group. Maybe it's just one person that you focus on deepening your connection with. And maybe you spend time with that person recalling memories of things that you've done before at work or as friends in your history. All of those things can help the holidays be a time of meaning, be a time of value, and not a time when you feel disconnected from the people that you care about. Question number 3 is, how do you balance the need to be alone and have downtime with the need to be involved to some degree with holiday celebrations? And that's a real conundrum that a lot of us who feel lonely from time to time can experience. You know, it seems kind of a paradox that when you think about loneliness, one would think that the feeling of loneliness would motivate us to reach out to other people, to spend time with others, to make connections, that it would have sort of an approach motivation. But in fact, research tells us, and maybe some of you know from your own experience, that when you feel lonely, often your tendency is to withdraw, is to avoid other people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think time alone and having downtime from other people can be very therapeutic. for us. But I think the answer to this question hinges on why you feel an obligation to be involved in holiday celebrations in the first place. And I use that word obligation intentionally. If it is done out of a sense of obligation, I need to go to these people's house, or I need to go caroling with these folks because they're expecting me to, then I think those activities, even if they involve being around other people, can feel very hollow, can feel very shallow and unfulfilling to us. So if you're doing that because you feel obligated to do it, I think an answer to that question is reevaluate whether that obligation is really necessary for you, or whether it's more important, whether it would be more therapeutic for you just to spend that time alone or with one other person where that interaction is very meaningful. If, however, you are thinking to engage in those activities, those holiday experiences with other people, because it gives you a sense of connection, then of course that can be very therapeutic. But even if you're doing that, even if you're spending time around family or spending time around friends, I think it's really important to create space and make a plan for when you do need downtime and honor that. And don't feel like you have to apologize for that. Think to myself, if I feel overwhelmed, if I start to feel a little overwhelmed by this social interaction, which can absolutely happen, this happens to me frequently, where can I go, or what can I do, or how can I sort of extricate myself from the proceedings, even for a short period of time, to find some space to recharge. And that's especially important, I think, if you're going to be in a space where you don't necessarily have control over how you're spending your time. Like if you're involved in a holiday activity that someone else is directing, or if you aren't in charge of the dinner schedule or whatever, if you're not the one making the plan, then I think it's even more important that you have a plan for yourself. And don't apologize for that. I think it's just fine to say to somebody, you know, I'm just going to take a few minutes for myself. I'll be back and rejoin the conversation. And then, of course, you know from your own experience, if you've done this before, that when you take that time, when you honor that need for yourself, then you come back to that interaction refreshed. And you come back to it able to engage in a meaningful way. Whereas if you ignore that need, if you ignore the draw to have some downtime, then you just feel more and more spent and less engaged. Question number 4 is, how do I help my mom to deal with grieving the loss of my dad when I'm grieving myself? The holidays, can be stressful under the best of circumstances, but they're even more so when you are dealing with the loss of a loved one, when this is the first Thanksgiving or the first Hanukkah or the first New Year's without somebody who's been important in your life. And when you're with family, of course, everybody or multiple people in that gathering may be grieving that loss. That's the situation here in this question. I think one thing that's really important to realize and to allow for is the possibility that your mother may be grieving the loss differently than you do. When it comes to grief, everybody grieves. That's a natural, that's a very normal, and can be a very healthy response to a significant loss in our lives, but that doesn't mean that everybody grieves in the same way. And even if you are grieving the same loss, you and your mother in this situation are both grieving the loss of your father, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're grieving in the same way, and that's absolutely fine. The problem comes when we presume that other people who are grieving the same loss we are grieving in the same way, and therefore need the same things that we do. And this happens quite frequently when we know that other people are hurting. We think to ourselves, how would I feel in that situation, or how am I feeling? And what sorts of things would I need, or do I need? And then we sort of project that on the other person. We sort of presume that if this is how I feel, or these are the things that I would need, then those are the things that other person needs. And so we offer those things, or sometimes we just proactively do those things, without stopping to ask ourselves, am I sure that's actually what the other person wants? or needs in that situation. We do this out of the best of intentions, of course. But I think it's really useful to remember that just because somebody else is dealing with a loss that you're dealing with as well, it doesn't mean that they need the same things that you do. And so it's a very simple piece of advice here, and that is to ask the person to say, you know what, I know we're both really missing Dad right now. I know we're both really grieving that loss. What are the things that I can do that would be useful to you? How can I be helpful to you? And then if you're grieving that loss too, it's useful to express the things that you want or need, so that neither of you is making an assumption about what the other person wants or needs in that situation, but you're being cognizant of the fact that the other person may be experiencing that grief very differently. Now, if there is a good thing about the fact that you're both grieving in that situation, that good thing, that silver lining, is that it gives you an ability to empathize with your mother. Now, when we're not grieving that loss ourselves, when it's somebody that we didn't know or who wasn't significant to us, we can sympathize with other people, and that's very important as well. But we can't truly empathize in the same way that we can if we're both dealing with that loss. And so depending on the relationship that you have with your mother, I think a second piece of advice could be to try to create space. It may not be during the holidays, but try to create space when you can sort of grieve together. I'm thinking of things like go out for an important dinner together, or plan a weekend where you can get away together, or spend time, create space where it can be just the two of you. And you can talk with each other about your grieving, and you can share memories of your dad, and you can talk about life without him now and what that means to each of you, without the distractions of other people around you or the kinds of day-to-day responsibilities that you tend to have normally. Create that space because you're both grieving to grieve together. And many people find that when they do that, it not only brings them closer together, which can be another benefit of having to go through that terrible experience, but it also helps you to make meaning out of that situation and to realize how the two of you, whose relationship is going to move forward, can endure that situation and move forward in your lives despite it. Question number 5, I'm basically trying to let my family go because of child and emotional abuse related to me being a part of the LGBT community. Any advice for staying busy? I have plans to spend Christmas with my aunt and uncle, who my parents don't speak to, but that's about it. How can I stay strong in the face of an extremely toxic and hurtful family who still want a relationship with me? This is a complicated question, and it's one that unfortunately so many people have to deal with because of disagreements with their family, or their family doesn't accept them for who they are, doesn't accept them for who they married. There's any number of reasons why family relationships can seem very toxic. And dealing with toxic relationships is always extremely difficult, all the more so when those relationships are family. And I think all the more so still when those relationships are parents, because that's speaking to a very primal bond that we have, a very primal attachment. And when parents become toxic in our lives, that can be a real threat to our identity and our ability to feel attached in the world. Of course, a very important first step in this process, like in many things, is recognition, is recognizing that a relationship has become toxic. And related to that, I think that when many of us find ourselves recognizing that a relationship is toxic, especially a family relationship, we deal with that for a long period of time by telling ourselves, well, I'm going to help that person change, or maybe over time things are going to get better and they're going to come to accept me, or they're going to come to have more realistic expectations of me, or whatever it is that's causing that relationship to be toxic, we tend to harbor hope that that person is going to change, and that can keep us trapped in many ways in a relationship that becomes very unhealthy for us. And so I think a very important second step is coming to a point of recognition that if this person or if this relationship has been toxic in your life over a period of time, that person is not likely to change. I'm not saying that it can't happen or that it hasn't happened, but it's improbable. When people treat you in that very toxic way, especially despite the fact that they're your family or even still that they're your parents, it's not likely that that person is going to change. And so that puts the onus on you to make decisions. And really the important decision here is knowing when it's time to make a clean break from that relationship. I don't underestimate how challenging that can be. And for most people, that's a process. It's not just waking up one day and saying, okay, you're no longer a part of my life. But as this question implied, I'm working on this over time. And I think that the fact that that's a process is a good thing because it allows you to slowly remove toxic people from your lives and then deal with or become accustomed to what that means for you and how you're going to deal with the loss of those people once they are truly no longer in your life. But in doing that, I think it's also very important to set a deadline. Even if it's not a hard deadline, but set a deadline so that your process isn't just repeating itself over and over and you don't really have an exit plan. It's very important to be able to envision that time when those people are not going to be in your life any longer. And in doing that, I think a few different things can be really valuable. One of those is living in the present rather than in the past with that relationship, reminiscing about the way that the relationship used to be. Or even living in the future, and that is that you're hoping that things are going to get better or holding out hope that that toxic person is going to change. I think it's really important too, and this is not easy for people to do in this situation, to be self-reflexive and to be honest about the role that you have played in making that relationship problematic. I think most of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, recognize that it's not just that somebody else is doing bad things to us, but as we reflect on that relationship, if we're being honest, we realize that, well, maybe I didn't make the best decision here, or maybe I've contributed in some way to creating that toxic environment. And for many of us, admitting those things, reflecting on them, identifying them, accepting that we played a role in how that relationship became so problematic is harder than ending the relationship itself. That's not an easy thing to do. And then finally, pay attention to the things that we're telling ourselves about that relationship. And many of us, whether we realize it or not, tell ourselves that we can't leave that relationship. And I think it's important to replace can't leave with won't leave. I haven't left. I won't leave the relationship. And that's where we need to work on. That's what we need to change in the dialogue, in the monologue, I suppose, that we tell ourselves. Not that we can't leave the relationship, but that we just haven't yet. And that therefore that's something for us to do. Can't leave doesn't leave us any possibility. Won't leave allows us space. It allows us room to change that strategy. And the things that we tell ourselves in those situations are really important. They're really consequential. So they're worth paying attention to. Question number 6, what has worked the most in making the most of the holidays without our loved ones? This gets back to an issue that we talked about before. When you've lost a loved one, how can you make the most of the holidays? It's a very difficult thing, especially when it's the first holiday without that person. And when we lose somebody significant in our lives, many of us mark that process, that first year, by this is our first Easter without this person. This is our first 4th of July without this person. Whatever the holiday is, we use it to kind of mark the first time we're experiencing that without that person there with us. And when it's a holiday and especially when there's many people around, one of the things that can make that really difficult, not having that person there, is that there can be uncertainty about whether it's okay to talk about that person, whether it's okay to recognize that we're missing this person. So let's say that you've lost your spouse or you've lost your parent, and you're the person at that holiday gathering for whom that loss was the most significant. Other people around you can feel like they have to maybe walk on eggshells a little bit. Is it okay for us to bring up grandma, or is it okay for us to bring up your husband who has died? And so I think that when you're that person, you can set the tone that not only is it okay to talk about that person, it's encouraged. And I think that can be so therapeutic. Use that time with your family and your friends there to talk about your loved one, to share memories, especially fond memories, to tell stories, to interject humor, talk about humorous or fun times that you spent together. When you create that expectation that it's encouraged that people share their memories of that person, that creates a very therapeutic space. I think. And when you spend that time remembering good things about that person or humorous stories about your times together, it can just be such a, first of all, a stress reliever for you during the holidays, and also a time to kind of remind you of why that person was so important to you in the first place. I think a second thing that can make those holiday times really stressful under normal circumstances, especially when you're dealing with a significant loss, is that holidays and holiday traditions can become very complicated. You can think to yourself, well, we always did all of these different things when this person was alive, and so I feel obligated to keep all of those traditions alive even without that person with me. And I think that it can be so useful to just let go of so many of those obligations, simplify. Say, you know what, I don't need to do all of these different things. I'm going to pick the one or two traditions that mean the most to me. And then give yourself permission to let the rest of those things go. When you simplify what you have to do to sort of put on that holiday, then it gives you space to spend meaningful time with the other people who are there. Spend time in conversation or reminiscing about the person that you're missing, instead of feeling like you have to be in charge of all of these other things that you feel like you need to do to honor that person's memory. I think a third piece of advice, and this can be difficult to talk about when you are grieving the loss of somebody, especially during the holidays, is to be really aware of things that you're doing to cope with that loss that can be maladaptive. So it's not uncommon for people when they're grieving to turn to alcohol or to eat excessively or to sleep excessively, to turn to substances to help them get through. All of these things can make us feel better in the short run, and that's why we do them. They help us sort of dull the pain or get through the day without that person or with the stress that we're dealing with. But these things can be very maladaptive. They're not the kinds of coping strategies that we want to turn to, because of course they have some significant side effects, or they can, especially if we abuse those coping strategies. So just be aware of the things that you're doing to cope with the stress or to cope with that feeling of loss, and be careful about those things. Turn to your family, turn to your friends, turn to ways of dealing with that stress that are going to be more adaptive for you in both the short run and the long run. The last question on the list is, how do you handle not being able to go to holiday house parties at people's homes, because most of those homes aren't accessible for wheelchairs? It's a really interesting question, and one that, of course, many of us don't have to deal with. It's not something that I've had to deal with in my own experience. So I really can only answer this question speculatively. But I think a couple things come to mind for me. And one of those is to remember that even though most of our homes, even though most people's personal homes aren't necessarily wheelchair accessible, that doesn't mean, and we shouldn't interpret that as meaning, that those people don't want us there. if we need that accommodation. It can feel that way at times, that if you've invited me to your home and yet you don't have the accessibility, you don't have the capabilities for me to actually accept that invitation, then it means that you don't really want me there, that you don't really value my company. And I think that's really important to remind ourselves that that's a delusion, that it's not true at all. That if the people took the time and made the effort to invite you, that in fact, quite the opposite is true, that they actually do want you there. And if they don't need to have those accommodations for the people who live in that house, that's just the way that is. And don't read anything into that related to your relationship. But I think a second piece of advice, once we remind ourselves of that, is that you may be able then to suggest, because their home isn't wheelchair accessible, that perhaps if they want to host a party, that they host it in a different space. So you might be able to say something like, I honestly have a really difficult time coming to your home, getting in, moving around. It's just not really, that space just really isn't conducive to the things that I need. So what would you think about perhaps hosting that party, say, at my house, which would be accessible, or in a public space, like in a restaurant or an event space that would have the accessibility? I think that many people would be very open to that suggestion, because it's not necessarily about making you come to their home, making you come to their space. Hosting a party for most of us is about being around the people that we want to have there. And again, for many of us, if we don't have to deal with the need for that accommodation on a daily basis, it may just not be a part of how we think about getting around in our daily lives. And, we can't fault other people for that. We all live in our own experience. But there's nothing wrong with reminding people that, not everybody's experience is the same as yours, and I have a different experience. I need certain accommodations that your home doesn't provide. So I think for many people, we'd be more than happy to consider, where else might I be able to host that event that would make it much easier and more conducive for you to be there and for you to enjoy your time there. So again, those are just speculations. It's not something that I've had to deal with in my own life, but putting myself in the place of somebody whose home isn't accessible and who may invite people who need those accommodations, I'm thinking from that point of view that I'd be more than happy to host my event in a space that would be conducive to you being a part of it. Those are the questions, and I see that I'm running out of time. So I just really like to thank you for spending this time with me. And for those of you going into the holidays with a sense of dread, maybe because of loneliness or because of losing somebody, know that these are very normal struggles. These are very natural things to feel apprehensive about. But also know that it doesn't mean that you can't find value in the holidays and that you can't find meaning in the time that you're going to spend with other people, or even in the time that you're going to spend alone. Feel brave. Feel a sense of efficacy, that you can go into the holidays and find value in that time. So I wish you all the best, both in dealing with the holidays and in managing the things that you're dealing with in your life on a day-to-day basis. Thank you so much.